back, everyone. The first thing to say is that Archbishop Justin is very sorry that he's not able to be with us for this session. But we do have 5 of our presidents, and we're very grateful for them being here. When I told my 5-year-old son about Forum, I tried to explain what it was. And I said, well, you know, people ask questions. And he said, will you be answering them? I said, no. And then I explained that there were some other people answering the questions. And he said, but what if they get the answer wrong? And he rather thought it was something like a quiz show. And I tried to explain, well, there isn't really a wrong answer. What do you mean? Anyway, there are no wrong answers, just to reassure you all. We're looking forward to what you have to share with us this morning. Or maybe there are wrong answers. Yes. So we've got a series of questions that have come out of the small groups that have just met. We won't get through all the questions, and we won't have time for every president to say something for each question either, so they're just going to indicate if they'd like to take a question. And we'll start off with this one. How can the churches together fulfill the ministry of reconciliation in such a divided country as is Britain in the light of Brexit? We had to have a Brexit question. Who'd like to take that? Start us off.
It was good till we got to Brexit.
Avoid the subject.
Not allowed.
Well, be it Brexit, be it any other issue that could divide us, I think for us to speak well of each other, to pray for each other, to be seen to be with each other. In some ways, we were talking earlier about us being seen to be together, to be friends together. And I think that does set a great example and model for how we would like our communities to be.
Yeah. I've just come back from, as I said last night, a wide European meeting, and that was one of the questions constantly put to myself as the only person there from the United Kingdom. And I just said, well, from a church perspective, we would want to maintain a very clear distinction between the life of the people of Europe and the political institutions. And what the negotiations are about are essentially how the political institutions operate and a different set of relationships. But our job is to ensure that the solidarity and the friendship between the peoples of Europe, and especially with the peoples of this country, remain strong and firm.
One more.
I think what we stand for here and what we do transcends political differences and temporal things. I mean, in 2 years' time, we're going to think about Brexit and thinking, oh, what was the fuss, or why that was really bad, but it will pass. Whereas what we're representing here is something that is far more long-lasting and has outlived empires and nations and wars. And so that is the hope we need to give people, that Christ is at the core of this, and his church, although currently fragmented, but his church has been serving faithfully throughout centuries and will continue to do so.
Thank you. You just mentioned the church currently being fragmented, and the next question we have is, does it matter if different prophetic voices, drawing from the same gospel, say different things when speaking into society?
These questions are great because what happens, we sit here listening to the first part and think, I know the answer to that. And then the last 2 words, like Brexit and this time into society, really just changes the whole thing. I think we as a church have got to get used to the fact that different prophetic voices will say different things. And I think that when Paul counseled the church in Corinth and said, let the prophets speak and let the others judge, I think judging prophecy is something that the church must do. I think what we have been a little bit hasty in at times is to go public on things that we ought to weigh together before we speak it out into the wide world. So I do expect to hear different prophetic voices saying different things. I think we've got a responsibility to listen and to judge those words, and then probably to work out how we speak into society. And I think also one of the things that we do need to do is when things get spoken into society that we feel uncomfortable about, there are times when we can actually bring a balance. One of the things that's meant a lot to me in my ministry over the years is that story in 1 Kings 4 where, you know, the young enthusiastic prophet who sliced things into the pot that everyone deemed to be poisonous, and everyone was screaming, "There's death in the pot." The thing that I love about that story is that Elisha, with absolute Mr. Cool characteristics, just comes and puts in a handful of flour, and everything just calms down. I think we do need that kind of grace today, where sometimes when things are said that are a bit inflammatory, that we do know that we've got people that can speak into the situation that can bring a balance. So that's the kind of thing that we have to do. We do expect that kind of diversity. Prophetic voices will always have that edge to it, but we just need to make sure that we can help society come to terms with what we believe the Lord is saying into the situation.
And I think we're called to live prophetically, not just speak it. And the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus. So does it look and feel like Jesus as we live our lives among our communities? And so let's live more and probably speak less, I would say.
I think there are two issues to this to me. One is, how do our different churches find their voice? And there's real differences between us in those things, which is fine. And within each church there will be a diversity of voices. But there's one underlying kind of reserve that I hold, and that is we should be very prudent. We should be very, very thoughtful about deliberately and sharply seeking to disturb the good conscience of other people. And I think the pathway of discernment, of trying with a certain respect, a certain reverence towards another point of view is quite important in all of this. We should not go about trying to disturb good consciences unless it's very clear.
Okay, our third question. We are grateful for the glimpse into the relationships of trust between the presidents. What more are the presidents going to do, underlined, to demonstrate this publicly, underlined twice, in the next 3 years, and so help encourage the same to happen at the local level? It's your turn.
You know, I was listening to the questions and hoping that I'd get an easy one, and then I would dive in there and answer it. But now I've got this one. No, but on a more serious note, it's actually quite. It's relatively easy to answer in the sense that we just spoke about it at our meeting 15 minutes ago, and we were saying to ourselves that we need to do more, and encouraging ourselves to do more in a practical sense, to allow the relationships we've developed and are developing to percolate down to the parish level, the churches that are out there, the churches in our constituencies. And so what do we do practically? Some things we said, some things were implied. Firstly, we take every opportunity to showcase this unity, and that goes a long way. When people see that there is this unity. The question has a reason, because someone here has seen the unity, the friendship showcased. And we have to get it outside groups like this and get it into our constituencies and get it all the way down to the grassroots level, that this can happen. Pictures are very powerful. Graphic pictures are very, very powerful. That's the first thing. Second thing, of course, we appreciate that the world now, a significant part of what happens in the world is shaped by social media. And so we've got to get on with that, understand it, use it to advance the kingdom's cause by strategically sending that message out through social media. I think we've also we have a responsibility to go back to our own constituencies and talk about it and encourage our constituencies to take what will be steps out of their comfort zones to start to build relationships at all levels with each other. I think fourthly, we have to pray about it. That's what Jesus encourages us to do, and we have to pray about it, knowing that there's a whole hierarchy of evil that does not want those relationships built and that unity built. I think there'll be many other things, but I think as we start to do those things, start to step out of our comfort zone, start to build relationships, encourage our people to build relationships, not necessarily in a formal way, but just the little things like eating together, praying together, things that just generally bring people together. I think we will start to see a multiplier effect and stronger relationships built, and that can only be for the good of the body of Christ.
And I also think at a wider level, we as the church have been guilty in the past of seeing things happen around us, whether here or abroad, and not saying anything, because there wasn't the vehicle for all of us to speak. Now, CTE, to my mind, presents that opportunity. Now, my church was a member of CTE through the Oriental Council of Churches and has been for about 20 years. But I made the proactive decision to also join CTE independently as the Coptic Orthodox Church, because I felt it was a great vehicle for that. And again, in our meeting, we just discussed the importance for us as presidents to comment on certain things that we can comment on. And I think the trust between us says that when I draft something, I draft it with a mind that it's not going to compromise the cardinal or anybody else. And I think we all have that, because we're not there to outshine each other. We're not there to trip each other into a hole. We're there to actually speak with each other. And I think if we have that as the foundation of what we're doing, then it allows us to witness more openly and much more powerfully.
Can I just be very practical and brief? At the end of our meeting, we asked the staff of CTE to draw together a kind of menu of possible things that we might do together. Our next meeting is in November, and I'd like to invite anybody in the room who has a thought about what this presidency might do together to please to give it to Paul, and he can put it in this menu, which we look at in November.
So another question, which follows on from that very well, really. You've been talking about how the presidents work together and support one another. How do the other churches support those churches who are in the valley and express our support and unity, remembering that we are all children, brothers and sisters of Christ, so that the world can see our unity in the Lord?
Well, speaking as the Free Churches moderator, I've got 24 denominations. So actually, within our own context in the Free Churches group, this is something that's very real to us. We're very much aware of where each other's at. We meet together twice a year to hear where each denomination's at, if there's an opportunity, and then we pick up on those kind of things and work together. And when you look at that kind of size of constituency and you realize that that is what's happening there, it's not difficult to understand that heart then is reflected through the whole of CTE. There's a real desire, certainly amongst us as presidents, when we pick up those things, to be there to help one another. Obviously, with the larger denominations, with the Church of England and the Catholic Church, and even with the Orthodox churches, there's probably a more coherent pattern than I face with 24 different denominations to look after. But that spirit of being there for one another, I think, is very important, and it's very much what I think CTE is about.
There's a small evangelical church just down the road from us that was in quite a difficult position, and they asked for help, and I was considering whether we should help them or not. I read the story of the Good Samaritan, and I felt God speak to me and say, if you see your neighbor dying and bleeding, help them. And so I think for us personally, we thought, okay, if they're in need, we will do what we can to resource them, support them, pray for them, send worship leaders, preachers, whatever it is they need for that season to help them get well again. So that would be our sort of attitude, I believe, that we all need to have, that if we see a person in need, a church in need, if we have got the resource to help, then why not step in and help?
How can we find alternative methods to measure success, in inverted commas, that don't rely on numbers on Sunday?
I've realised that we've got a green team and a red team here. I think the green team's turn, I think.
Numbers on Sunday are very tempting, obviously, but they don't tell half of the truth. I mean, it's the Beatitudes, I think. You know, that should be our measure. And it's the degree to which we can see that the pathway from joy leads to God and the pathway from sadness leads to God. And the way in which we're helping each other to walk that. And they would come in things such as the celebration, how thanksgiving is echoed in a society as well as in a church community. How thankful are we? That would be a measure of success that I think would be nearer to the call of Jesus. And then secondly, how compassionate we are. I would have those two things, I think, as the main measures. Difficult to translate into numbers, but nevertheless, some actuary could probably do it. But those are the two, for me, sitting here, the two key qualities of thankfulness and of compassion or solidarity.
I think the challenge of that question is that there are some things that are tangible and can be measured. So you can measure who turns up on a Sunday. You can measure the number baptized. You can measure your income. But a lot of things we're talking about is hard to measure. How do you measure a church's or a person's influence in a community? How do you measure the work of Christ in someone's life? And so it gets harder to then put a measurement on it. So therefore we default back to the things that are easier to measure. So that's probably not an answer, but it's highlighting the challenge we face.
I think the thing I'd want to pick up in the question is that we really need to come away from the competitiveness that's been there within the churches in the past, where number counting wasn't about how much impact we're having on the world, but how well we're doing compared with each other.
Yes.
And I really think we've got to lose that. The kind of measures that we should have are much more to do with how is the church fulfilling its commission corporately, all together in terms of reaching the world. And I love what Cardinal Vincent said about, the Beatitudes are a good measure. How is the church demonstrating that into the world? The Free Churches Group is just about to do, it's just starting a piece of research, which all of the other presidents are linking into as well, which is looking at the church's impact on social cohesion throughout the country. And that's the sort of thing where I think maybe you can get a sense of how well the church is doing, not by looking at how many people are in our churches, but what actually is realistically happening out there in society. Are we a force that helps bring people together? Do we send them apart? And trying to be objective in looking at that might be a better way forward than number crunching, I think.
Can I do here's one I prepared earlier. My tweet I sent out a daily tweet. My tweet from yesterday is, as we consider the mission of the church, my personal prayer is that we feel a true sense of belonging, ownership and trust towards our parishes, dioceses and our church at large. Joyful that we are served and empowered to serve as we are called. And so I think if this sense of ownership, trust, I don't think it's about how many people who are there, but how many people there feel a sense of ownership and connectedness. And I think we're embarking on a survey process through our own diocese to actually try to capture that and see how many people feel connected to their church and their parish and the diocese and the church as a whole. And I think there is nothing worse than someone being in a pew and feeling they don't belong. And I think that is the greatest condemnation that we might have. So it's to be broad, and for us as an Orthodox Church, it's difficult because we're dealing with issues we never dealt with in Egypt over the past centuries. But to be, and what I'm finding more and more now is there is no longer a sense of one thing that means the church. We need to provide a diversity of things where each person feels connected. Now, there are some red line issues, but as far as we can, we need to stretch to be able to incorporate and involve everyone.
I just want us to be careful not to go so far to the other end that we actually end up not doing what we should. So whilst the focus is not on numbers, but the focus must be on growth. And numbers is a factor of growth. And we must, if we're not growing, we mustn't find ourselves on the other side where we say, well, it doesn't matter that numbers are not showing up because we're doing all these many other things. It matters that people are not coming to the church. And so we must ask ourselves the hard questions. Why are people not coming to the church? Why is the church not growing? Why don't we have the numbers? Because those are questions that we must face. The church should grow. And if the church is not growing, then we must ask ourselves, as we are asking within our own group, in our constituency, why is the church not growing like it should? The focus is not on the numbers, but the church of God should grow. And part of the advance of the kingdom is that the church of God is growing. And we mustn't shy away from those hard questions that we ask ourselves. The numbers is not the issue. Growth, I think, is the issue. So 10 people might show up at his church, 5 people might show up at mine, 1,000 people might show up at his, but we all must be able to say the church is growing in the way, because don't forget, the early church, God himself added the numbers to the church as he saw fit, but he added the numbers. And if God is not adding the numbers, we must ask ourselves some serious questions, because there are things that we should be doing, and maybe there are things that we are doing that is not allowing God to add the numbers like he should. So I wouldn't run away from numbers. That's what I'm saying to our guys. I'm saying this thing is not working because it's not growing. And doing all these other things, fantastic, because it's the whole gospel. But don't ignore this part of it. This kingdom is supposed to grow. And the way we measure the growth of the kingdom is that the people are coming on Sunday and sitting in the churches and are listening to the gospel and are being transformed, being discipled and changed and going out. And if they are not coming, we must ask ourselves some hard questions.
A number of groups asked questions about diversity. So how do we become more intentional about diversity in its fullest terms? And linked in with that, again, very specifically, how can we be relevant to the world outside the church when the CTE presidents are all male?
Well, this Mail, this is my last public appearance as president, and we have one more meeting. And the next person taking on this role is a younger female. And so we are making a step in that direction.
Yes, I must say that in some ways that's my fault, because when the vacancy came up within the Free Churches group, I realized that if it was a male appointed, we'd end up with an all-male presidency. But there was no female candidate at the time. But it's certainly good to know that that's changing. In the diversity issue, let me just share something which may be helpful. I was leading a large independent church in a very white borough of London. And I knew that part of our mission as a church was to have an impact London-wide. And London-wide is very diverse. And I realized that my church would have to become more diverse if it was going to have that kind of impact. And so there was one Sunday when we were having multiple services, and so one of the services we'd got quite a lot of empty chairs. And at the time I said, is there anyone here who's got at least one non-white grandparent? That was how difficult it was in Bromley to find anyone who wasn't white. So anyone with at least one non-white grandparent. I said, because I'd like you to come forward and I'd like you to pray over the empty chairs, because I believe the church has got to become more diverse. And although that was a very simple thing that we did, it was amazing how quickly the church changed. And it was just, I think, coming out of the intentionality. It wasn't easy to start with, because when people from different backgrounds started coming into the borough at that particular point, their friends and relatives were saying, you sure it's safe to go into Bromley? Because that's just how white Bromley was. It had a bit of a Bexley reputation at the time. But these things have changed. And in some ways, I know that the intentionality that we had as a church to become more diverse actually had an impact on the community as well. So I would encourage to pick up on that, saying that if you are serious about diversity, intentionality is a very key word in it. It's not something that you just sit back and say, well, maybe one day. And the other thing that you've got to realize is that when someone comes in who is an initial expression of diversity, it's very difficult for them, you know. And yet, you know, churches pray for multiplication. And I say to them repeatedly, you can't have multiplication until you've had additions. You know, if you've got a bowl of oranges and you pray that you'll multiply, you're not going to suddenly find apples in the bowl. So some of us that want to be diverse have really got to go through the process of how do we add people from different backgrounds, and when I'm saying that, I'm not just talking about ethnic backgrounds. I think some of our churches are ethnically diverse and yet socio-economically very, very singular with very little diversity at all. And we need to be intentional about the diversity. And part of that is how we pray and how we plan. I often get invited to speak at black majority churches. I spend a lot of my time in that area. And one of the things I'm saying to them is, look, find people in the church that have already got good relationships with neighbors of different ethnicities and work with them and encourage them and build those kind of relationships. There are things that we can do if we're intentional, but intentionality is important. And also when people come in, you've got to really help them settle, because the first banana in the fruit bowl doesn't feel comfortable, if you know what I mean. And you've got to work on that to make sure that people stay, because it makes it easier for the next person coming in.
Just a complimentary thought. At our celebration of Mass this morning, the first reading was from the 12th chapter of the first letter to the Corinthians. So it was precisely about the analogy of the body, and then extended to a reflection on the different gifts given to the church. And just hearing that this morning just makes me want to say, let's not simply look at diversity through current cultural norms. You know, there are many, many facets to diversity which Paul was getting at. And what was important in the message of St. Paul was he was saying, recognize the complementarities and don't pretend that the different parts of the body or the different charisms given to the church all boil down to one thing. So not to be simply thinking about diversity in cultural terms, but also in thinking about diversity to respect complementary differences.
A cautionary note, and I'm sorry if this is offensive to anyone. I don't mean it to be, but I think sometimes when we focus so much on diversity, we become extremely discriminatory. And I think we need to genuinely be blind to race, color, ethnicity, genuinely. So when I look at my brothers here and my sisters on the panel, I don't see them as Catholics or Free Church or evangelicals, and I don't see that. Genuine when I'm dealing with them. Now when I'm thinking theologically and dogmatically, that is a reality. But day to day, in our interactions, in our love and mutual respect, I don't see that. And I think that's where we need to be. It's not just we need to be all-encompassing. So if you're not encompassing, then you're really bad. Because we all have our idea of what that means. We need to understand one another.
We've got time for one last question, which you'll have to answer fairly briefly. In the context of Jesus cleansing the temple and turning over tables, what table would you turn over in your own denomination?
I think this, for me, is quite an easy question to answer at the moment, because I think we're being given a very, very clear, persistent lead for the Catholic Church by Pope Francis, and he talks insistently about clericalism. And by that, he means the assumptions of superiority, the assumptions of a position of privilege, the assumption of provision of everything that is needed, that sometimes characterizes the clerics in the Catholic Church. And he wants that table vigorously and rapidly turned over.
I'd say the same. Assumptions of superiority. I think when they come in, they really hinder everything. And they can be just as present within the independent church sector, the new church movement, and everything else. Once you start feeling superior, that's a table that needs to be overturned if we're going to stay relevant. I
think what Bishop and Gail said, seeing each other as human beings, brothers and sisters, before everything else is important. And the other more flippant one, apart from Andy Howe, flag waving.
There are so many tables that I want to overturn. I don't even know where to start. And there's also what probably directly concerns the Redeemed Christian Church of God, which I represent, and what concerns the larger constituency of the Pentecostals, and they might be different in both. But amongst the tables that I desperately want to not just overturn, but fling out of the window if I could, would be a very religious spirit that stifles true spirituality. And then would be also the culture. And I'm not talking about a kingdom culture, but I'm talking about where the culture of the people is so strong that it prevents others who have different cultures from coming in and feeling comfortable in the church.
Just following on from Pastor Agu, I think the reality of Orthodox churches is there are 20 around the world, comprising from both families, and they all were established in a particularly cultural, ethnic setting. And so it's very easy to become set to that silo. But that's not, they weren't established that way because they didn't want to interact with anybody else, but that was a reality. If Coptic Christians were in Egypt and people didn't move globally as we do now. But to be able to come out of those silos and realize that there is no longer a need for us to be separated, but to understand, even if we don't fully accept everything, we still understand and we appreciate and we value and we respect. And I think that would be wonderful, because then the mystique that surrounds some of our churches is torn down, and we can really see each other for who we are.
So I'd just like to ask Ruth to lead us in prayer.
And just before I do that, we do just want to thank our presidents again very much for being with us.